So I'm just going to take a brief look now at some of the legal issues arising from both the shortlisting and interview stages of the recruitment process, and in particular focusing on how you can best minimise the risk of any discrimination claims from any applicants. So when we're looking at the shortlisting stage in the process, really what we're looking to do is see how individuals match up against what we need in the job from the individual carrying it out. And really the best way of doing this is just looking at the person's specification and scoring the job applicants against that specification. And the best way of kind of doing this is really thinking, okay, what elements of this are really important for the role, and should we be weighting those? Because if there's a skill or a particular type of expertise which really forms the majority of the individual's role, then that really ought to be given greater weight than perhaps, if you like, a nice to have, or something which is only needed for part of the time when the individual's carrying out their role. But before you kind of launch into that scoring exercise, it's worth thinking about how you're actually going to grade people, because you want to ensure some consistency between the different individuals you look at, and particularly so if the application is going to be sifted by different people. As an example, here at Fox Williams, we recently went through our trainee solicitor recruitment, and a number of us looked at different applications, and so it's very important for us to take a uniform approach to ensure that one person wasn't scoring people more harshly and others being more lenient. So, for example, on work experience, we had 4 points available, ranging from no prior work experience whatsoever, through to a bit of work experience, through to some legal work experience, and then to substantial legal experience. And if you have that kind of clear direction to people carrying out the scoring exercise, then you're going to put yourself in a very good position, because what it means is if someone does complain, oh, why didn't I progress through, you can say, well, look, we followed this very objective, rational assessment exercise, and you just simply didn't make the cut. In terms of assessing how people move forward, say typically to the interview stage, if that's the next stage, you can take a couple of different approaches. You could say, well, actually for this role, we really need someone to have, say, a minimum of X out of 100 in order to go through. Alternatively, if you are happy just to consider, say, the top 10% or top 10 individuals, you can set that as a threshold. So you simply take a kind of cut-off line and you look at the people above it and you say no to the people beneath it. As we've already touched on, there's often a tendency to look at social media profiles when you're going through the shortlist, not just look at the application. Most people, particularly if they've got an unusual name, are very easily Googleable. And I think really there, the kind of key takeaway point really is just to focus really on their professional profiles, because really that's what's relevant to how they're going to do their job, and try at least not to be distracted by what you see on their personal profiles. If you do have a record of going through their personal profiles, then that risks at least some subconscious element of you taking into account, say, what they're doing in their personal lives, which is unlikely to have any bearing on their ability to do their job. It's all very well kind of giving people kind of clear guidance in terms of how to do it, the scoring exercise, but it may actually be necessary to give them some basic training as well. And if you can say that you've trained everyone who's going to be going through the scoring exercise, then that's obviously helpful too. We often find that some clients want to have some kind of check and balance. So whilst they may have clear guidance in terms of, this type of experience gets this point and so on, it's quite helpful to have a second pair of eyes, a bit like exam papers. They're effectively looked at again, or at least a certain percentage of them are looked at again. So there's kind of a bit of a kind of check and balance, and sometimes that can be a helpful way of just making sure no one's kind of slipped through the net who's good, just because of the way that particular individual approached the scoring. In terms of the actual interview stage, basic kind of practical points such as where to hold it rarely throw up any problems in practice. However, a couple of years ago we did have a client who was going to hold their interview day and their assessment centre off-site at a country hotel, and they had an inquiry from a disabled candidate who was going to have difficulty getting there, and they actually just simply made arrangements for them to get there because they couldn't get there by public transport. In terms of who actually carries out the interview, there's no need to have a massive panel, but usually having more than one person is beneficial. There's a bit of kind of check and balance. If you can have a mixed, so if it comes to mixed gender, then obviously that's great. That's not always going to be possible or appropriate. The key thing is people who can make an informed decision on who's the best candidate for the job. But one thing that is very important is to try to take as a uniform approach to the interview as possible. So ideally ask, and preferably even in the same order, candidates exactly the same questions, because then you can be sure you're genuinely comparing like for like. And if you do face a discrimination claim, you could say, look, we asked all our candidates these 10 set questions. Now, on the screen there are some so-called big money questions, and obviously these are some kind of rather ridiculous examples of what types of questions which may get you in hot water. But I think the thing to look for is actually the slightly subtler versions of those. Because those you might not think of as creating problems, they can do in practice. And sometimes they can come up just in the way of kind of very kind of benign small talk, trying to put the individuals at ease when they first come in. You may be saying, oh, I don't recognise your surname. Is it Sri Lankan or is it South African? You may just be trying to make small talk, but actually you're suggesting the possibility of that actually playing some part in your decision-making process. Or you could be saying, oh, I saw in your CV you had some time out with your kids. Who's looking after them now? Really, that's actually not relevant to the individual's ability to do the job. And those are the types of things that, rather than the kind of more extreme ones up here, that people tend to come unstuck on. I think the overriding rule when actually asking questions is, do you actually need the information you're asking for? I think the best way of asking, getting to the bottom of that, is really saying to yourself, why are we asking this question? What are we trying to glean from it? Now, we couldn't really cover a session on recruitment without just touching very briefly on the concept of positive action. Now, this may ring some bells with some of you. It's not something that comes up an awful lot in practice, at least in the private sector. But under the Equality Act, there's scope to treat certain, if you like, disadvantaged groups in a more favourable way within very tight parameters. There's a general provision that you can say you take certain steps to enable participation amongst disadvantaged groups. So, for example, you could advertise in certain publications in order to try and attract as broad a group of candidates and applications as possible. But also there's a specific positive action in recruitment option. None of this is compulsory, it's all voluntary, at least in the private sector. The public sector has its own public sector equality duties, and if you're in the public sector, you're probably very familiar with those. But in recruitment, what you can do under the Equality Act is, if you're keen to advance one particular group where you feel within your organisation is underrepresented at the moment, or in some ways disadvantaged, if you found yourself in a situation where you had two candidates who were really neck and neck, and in the words of the Act, as qualified as each other, then you could, if you wanted to, choose the candidate from that disadvantaged group. I think in practice this has been enormously controversial, and most employers don't want to touch it with a barge pole because they don't want it to be taken into account at all. But just wanted to flag for you that there is that possibility. I spoke to someone before the Equality Act came into force in 2010, who spoke to someone who was working on the bill, and saying, what's the kind of rationale behind this? And they said, look, it's very much targeted at the public sector, and particularly with those parts of the public sector that want to be representative of the communities they serve. So, for example, the police force. It's not primarily intended to be used by the private sector, where that is a possibility. But as I say, I think most employers prefer not to go there, because they prefer just to try to attract as wide a group as possible.
Sorry, could you speak up? I can't hear you down here.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm now actually going to hand over to Helen, who's going to focus on the making the offer stage of the process.
Thanks, David. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay. So we've obviously selected, we've gone through the interview, and you're in the process of making the offer, and you decided to select Jill to replace George as the sales director. But you obviously got a disgruntled chap, James, who is asking now for feedback about why he was not selected. do you, and I'd be interested in see if anyone puts their hand up for this, do you just ignore the letter? Certainly I know no one will do that, okay, well I certainly know organisations that do. Do you reply but refuse to give any details on the basis that the process is confidential? Or do you go with the third option, which is to give full written feedback? What would anyone prepared to hazard a view or pick their hand up? Who'd go for number 2? No one? So would you all, I'm assuming everyone would go for 3, which is to give full written feedback. Okay. I think clearly there are some dangers with ignoring the letter, but to be honest, now that we've got the introduction of tribunal fees and we've also got early ACAS conciliation, I think a lot of organisations may well just take the view, okay, I'm just going to ignore this, I haven't got time to deal with it, you know, let's just put it in the drawer. If they want to sue us, they can, but they're going to have to pay money. The downside with taking that approach is, yes, you may call their bluff and they may not be prepared to pay the issue fee now, which is required to institute a claim for discrimination. But if you have ignored a request for information, then the burden of proof in your discrimination claim will shift. So what the inference is that the reason you didn't reply is because basically you had discriminated. And so you have to shift it back to say, no, we didn't. The reason we didn't recruit James is because of a reason. Yes.
I'm so sorry, I really can't hear you.
Can you not hear me? Oh, sorry.
No. They are such important things, and I'm here to recruit people, and I'm panicking that I can't hear you. And
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much.
If I can't, I've got my mic on, I'll try and move it around. Okay, if I hold it like that, I do feel a bit like Oprah or something like this, but if you just excuse us, then we'll go with this look. Okay.
Helen,
Yes.
is there not a bad PR angle of ignoring to give feedback? Because you sort of jump to the assumption that this person thought they would be discriminated against.
Yes.
Actually, isn't this person someone who's struggling to get a job and might like some feedback to help him with his next application?
No, I agree. I do agree with you, and obviously I would say the best practice advice would be obviously to give feedback. I just know that I'm not certainly. Please don't take that the wrong way. I'm certainly not advocating that people don't give feedback because that is the right approach. But the next issue is how much feedback do you give, and certainly you're not required to go to the extent of giving information about other candidates, you know, how the unsuccessful person compared in comparison to others in the pool. And I know some organisations have gone to that degree, and there is clear guidance that says you don't need to go to that extent. What you do need to do is to give, you know, very concise, I would say, reasons to justify why that person hasn't been selected, and hopefully you can point to, you know, something objective within the process that supported that decision. Okay, I think going on to the next point, would your answer change if James is a black South African? The reason that I put for flagging that up is that clearly, if that is the scenario, then you know, you are going to be more alive to a risk of a discrimination claim. And in those circumstances, it's clearly going to be best advice if you were tempted to go with option 1. I would say in that scenario, it would be definitely the right approach to give full written feedback. Okay, so moving on. I just wanted to, in the next slide, just touch on a couple of points that I know I've seen in practice often seem to get overlooked when you're making your job offer. The first is, do always make your job offer time limited. And often that's forgotten, but it's really, really good practice to do that. You really don't want to be in the scenario that you are used as a stalking horse, or the offer is out there indefinitely. The second point to make is a bit of a legal one, but it's really, you want some comfort that the candidate can't come back against the organisation and say, well, the only reason I accepted this job is because during the interview X promised me whatever, and that's why I'm here. And you know, so you don't want to come back and have some claim for misrepresentation. So get some clear writing that there's no inducement, there's no promise or representation made throughout the process as to why that could cause him or her to join you. The other point again is you need to have certainty about the terms of the contract. So make sure if your offer letter is including the terms and conditions of employment, that it's quite clear that this is it. There's nothing else. This letter, this document is the entire contractual legally binding agreement between the individual and the company. And the third point is, and this is relevant if you are recruiting someone who you believe will have restrictive covenants, you do not want that person's former employer to come against you on alleging that you have your company or organisation has induced that person to breach their contract by joining your company. And so in those circumstances, the best advice is to ask them to give you a warranty that by joining you, they are not breaching any other employment contract. And in some situations, it comes up from time to time, we are asked to give individuals advice or recommend another lawyer to give individuals advice in terms of whether there could be a breach of contract by joining you. Most offers are going to be conditional, and we're going to spend the next section looking at the normal pre-employment conditions, like references and so on. If you are accustomed to having the full details of your contract in a separate contract of employment, so the offer letter is a summary, what you need to do is to include a condition in the offer letter that the person will sign a contract of employment before joining, and that they won't join you or the offer falls away unless they do so. Okay, while we're sort of looking at offer letters, I think it was just worthwhile touching on record keeping. The reason for this is I think a lot of organisations do worry about this unduly perhaps. Yes, your obligations are to keep records, and if you look at that ECHR guidance, it sets out the categories of information that you need to keep. But do make sure that you keep the notes of interviews. You don't need to have a verbatim note, absolutely not. What you need is a concise summary, contemporaneous note as to why that person was selected or not, what the key points were. The next point is, well, how long do you keep your records for? Because the information is identifying a living individual, the Data Protection Act unfortunately comes into play here. And so you do need to consider keeping the records for an appropriate period of time and keeping records that are justifiable. The reason for putting the bullet points about the 3-month time limit for tribunal claims is that some organisations take the view, well, I'm going to keep these records of unsuccessful candidates for sufficient time to protect us in the event that their claim were to arise, and so perhaps I'm going to use that 3-month time limit as a marker, keep them for say 6 months, 9 months, and then shred them. The point about immigration records is that for those candidates that you employ, you do need to keep all of their immigration records throughout the period of employment and for 2 years afterwards. Okay, so we want to touch on pre-employment checks in a little bit more detail because there are a few legal issues that arise here. And just very quickly, back to our case study, Jill's application is obviously proceeding. I'm assuming pretty much everyone here would make an offer of employment conditional references. Has anyone ever gone with the option 3 scenario, which is that they've not made an offer of employment conditional references, perhaps because the person was known to someone in the organisation? Would anyone do that? Yes.
When we first started, it was very much a partnership that was set up basically for people who had worked together for quite a long time, and I think at that stage it was not reference based. But now obviously with regards to new employees, but at the time it was a group who were very well known to each other. So.
I think that's right. I think for certain small start-up type companies, absolutely, so many of them get off the ground as a group of friends or colleagues that work together well, and it's just not relevant. And let's be honest, so many organisations now, the type of reference that you get, they tend to be the very factual references, you know, A worked for X company between X and Y date as an accountant or whatever it might be, really doesn't tell you a lot. What it does do though, I suppose, is just verify their CV. That's not always the case, and I know that we've got people here from the university sector or public sector, and in those sectors, the references are still a lot more useful. The second point, option 2, is making the offer conditional on references, health checks and immigration checks. Would people use the health checks and immigration as a standard? Would that be, yeah. Would you use health checks as well as immigration as a standard? Yeah. That's quite interesting. I think Rebecca will probably pick up on that because we just said be a little bit cautious about using health checks as a standard, but absolutely immigration is an essential condition. Okay, so just looking at references, I think just two very clear points to make about that. Please don't give a verbal reference. I know lots of organisations have got into trouble from doing that. Don't be sort of lulled into a false sense of security. And the other point to really stress is that yes, we probably all do take up references, but as I've said, value is slightly limited. Now it's essential, becoming more essential, to check someone's professional and academic qualifications. You probably picked up the story about the water mitty lawyer last year who was masquerading as something hugely talented and with amazing credentials, all of which were made up. And you can imagine the PR that Paul Hastings, his law firm, suffered, was the reputational damage was quite immense. So do check, and I know that there are companies out there who will do CV checks for you.